episode 4 of the Modular Cookbook. Today we're doing something a little different. In the last few episodes, we've done everything within the modular, but for this exercise, we're expanding our world a little bit and incorporating a DAW and a drum machine. Ableton Live is running the show as a clock source, MIDI sequencer, and audio mixer, and the Tempest is following Live's MIDI clock, playing back a 2-bar drum pattern with its own sequencer. I'm syncing the modular with an audio clock from Ableton, which comes out of the interface and into the clock input of Pamela's new workout. Audio from the Tempest and the modular is going into the interface and is mixed in Ableton. Before we get to the patch, I'd like to take a minute to ask for your feedback. Since this channel's new and I'm still figuring out what I'm doing, I'm making a lot of assumptions about who the audience is for this stuff and what level everyone's at. So I'll let you know where I'm coming from. Here are a few general rules that I'm trying to stick to in this series. Number 1, I try to make stuff that I would want to watch. Number 2, if anything's questionable, I cut it. I might roll for a couple hours on a 30-minute episode, which means I'm most likely cutting some pretty good material, but I do have a tendency to ramble on mic, so if I'm unsure about a patch move or a joke or a tangent or a diversion, I'd rather err on the side of not wasting your time. Number 3, technique over technology. This is a big one. Working with these instruments is such a treat, it's such a luxury. Spending money to acquire neat stuff is an exciting and necessary part of the trip, but to me, the overwhelming focus on the gear and the purchasing and the collecting of it just doesn't feel all that healthy or creative, so stick to a familiar setup and try to go more deep than broad when it comes to gear. Number 4, I'm going to talk about what I know. Sort of a reflection of rule number 1. If you do your homework, you can learn all about the equipment and the great players and the techniques and the history of the art form, but when I see a great performance or hear a really interesting sound, I always want to ask things like, how'd you get here? What decisions led you to this? What's your life? What are your opinions about things? Who gave you permission to sound like you sound? And I'm playing it pretty safe so far in this series, but my goal is to try to answer the kind of questions that I'd like to hear answered, and since the only real meaningful or unique perspective I have on any of this stuff comes from my own trip, I'll try to stick to things that I actually have opinions or feelings about, and I'll try to keep it clear and concise. Those are my internal guideposts, and for the most part, I trust them, but this stuff goes out into the world, and I only hear what comes back to me, so if you have any thoughts on the content, or the pacing, or the format, or the assumptions I'm making about you, the viewer, your experience level, or attention span, you know where the comments are. And if you're wondering what the hell all this has to do with the video you're actually trying to watch right now, well, today I'm skipping through a lot of setup and getting right into the modular patch without covering any of the process of setting up the DAW or the interface or syncing the MIDI devices or adjusting the latency or the audio clocking setup or programming the drums or any of that, because I kind of assume you either already know that, have your own way of doing things, or can find that stuff pretty easily elsewhere. Is that a good assumption? I do have my own way of doing things. I've spent a while figuring it out, and I don't want to take that for granted, especially because sometimes I know that finding elegant solutions for some of the mundane, unsexy workflow things can be the most frustrating stuff. So if you think you might get some value out of my takes on how to approach some of these peripheral issues, speak up. All right, enough out of me. Let's patch. Modular Cook. Take a pulse wave from my primary oscillator and run it to the input on this Belgrade filter. If you're building this, I recommend using a cleanish filter. I tried this patch with all 4 of the filters in this rack, and I got the best results out of this Belgrade with very conservative levels, not overdriving it at all. You want like a nice, clean resonant sweep because we're going to modulate the filter at audio rate, and the sort of vocally, vowely formant effect that we're looking for comes across the most cleanly with a triangle-shaped modulator and a clean, resonant low-pass filter. Patch the filter's output to the amplifier's input, and take a stackable or a mult from the amplifier's output and run it to your mixer. Open up the VCA. Next, we'll patch up an envelope or a function, whatever you've got. We'll take that output and we're sending it to 3 places: the CV input of our amplifier, the FM input of our filter, and to the input of an attenuverter, which we will come back to later. And to control this voice, I'd like to use my MIDI keyboard, so I've got a MIDI to CV converter, and I'm keeping it simple and just taking 2 outputs from it. On this jack, I have volt per octave pitch CV, which I'll run into the volt per octave input on my oscillator. And on this cable, I've got a trigger signal that lights up every time I press a key on the keyboard. This is going to go to my envelope's trigger input. So when I play some notes on my MIDI keyboard, it behaves about like you would expect. So I'll start up the DAW, which will start up the drum machine, and I'll pick out a simple 1-bar bass line that I like. kept the bass line really simple and on a really short loop on purpose. I want the feel of this to be repetitive and hypnotic. I mean, maybe not this repetitive, so we're going to use some generative techniques to spice up this bass line, keep it moving, keep it interesting, without having to go in and program an 8 or a 16 or a 32 bar MIDI sequence with all the modulations exactly where we want them. We'll create some systems that will allow accidents to happen, and we'll keep what we like. But the first thing I need to do is backtrack a little bit. This is my first time using this MIDI to CV converter, and although I had high hopes for it, in the process of working through this patch, I discovered that the pitch tracking on it is terrible, and it's just audibly out of tune. So I'm going to pull this plug and recreate this bass sequence on the ER101, which does really precise voltages. I'll connect the CV output to my volt per octave input. We'll start the transport and see what happens. Notice I haven't patched up the gate output from the sequencer. Even though the pitch tracking on the MIDI to CV converter is trash, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with the gates, so I'm just using my original MIDI clip as a trigger source. See how it sounds with the drums. Alright, that works. The bass sounds kind of dry and flat though, so before we get into dressing up the sequence, let's set up an effects loop. I'll tap into this mult that we set up earlier out of the bass's VCA and run it into a mixer. Take the mix output, patch it through to the spring tank's input, patch the springs output into mixer channel 4. No special reason, I just always use 4 for my effects return. I like consistency. Hopefully not at the expense of a willingness to experiment. So I'll start up the sequence, bring up the send and return, and see what we've got. Oh, that's so much nicer to listen to. So the generative technique we're going to use here is taking a loop of one length, laying it over a loop of another length, and letting them interact however they interact. So what I want to do is add some octave jumps and some slides to this bass line. Little embellishments. And I'm going to use another sequencer channel to do that. Go to track 2, set it up the same way to multiply the incoming clock by 24. You can have different multipliers or divisors for each channel here, but I'm going to keep them all the same in this patch. Insert a step, and if our main sequence is 16 steps long, I'm going to overlay another sequence that's 12 steps long. And this sequence is just going to be responsible for octave jumps and slides. So let's pick a couple of random steps. Step number 2 will bump up by 12 semitones. Step number 9, also by 12 semitones. And number 12. So let's just listen to what that sounds like. Doesn't sound like much because the duration of all these notes is still set to 0, so it's not going to go anywhere. We'll do a math operation. Select the track, hold math, change the operation to set, and we'll make the duration, how about 12? So these are 8th notes instead of 16th notes. So it's actually a longer sequence than the original bass sequence. Let's try this again. Most of these steps don't put out any CV at all, and then there's the occasional 1 octave jump. I'll make this a little more interesting by going to the steps that have octave jumps, in this case step 2, go to the step before it, and activate slewing. And I'll make the gate length a little longer, let's say 8 pulses. So if the entire step is 12 pulses long, the slew is going to start after 8 pulses. So it'll be a fairly short ramp. I'll go through and do that to the other steps. 9 is a jump, so I'll activate smoothing on step 8. Step 12 is an octave jump, smooth step 11. Let's hear what this sounds like. Now what I want to do is combine this modulation with the original bassline CV that we programmed. And the way I'm going to do that is with a precision adder. A precision adder is like a mixer with no trim or level controls on it. It very precisely sums voltages together, and it's most commonly used to sum volt per octave pitch CV. Because if you have 2 voltages that are very precise and you sum them in an imprecise way, you're going to have pitchy problems, and everything's going to sound out of tune. So I'll take voltage A, run it into input 1, and yeah, this module is upside down. I just find it easier to get at that way. And I'll take the second CV, run it into input number 2, and take the output of that channel and run that to our volt per octave. So these 2 sequences are being summed together and then sent to the oscillator's volt per octave input, reset it to step 1, and start up the transport. The octave jumps and the slides are happening at a different point in the sequence every time the bass line repeats its 1-bar loop. Now we'll come back to this attenuverter. We went over this trick in episode 1, and we're going to do it again here. We're taking an inverted copy of our filter's cutoff envelope and patching it to the filter's resonance. I'll start the sequence, start turning up the resonance, and then when it starts to break up, I'll begin bringing in the inverted envelope, and you'll hear what happens. So we still get a really tasty, very resonant filter sweep, but at the very top of the peak it's just mellowed out a little bit. Notice this resonance is almost pegged at maximum, and if we unpatch the resonance modulation, it sounds like this. So it just tames and mellows out the more obnoxious part of the signal while still allowing us to have this beautiful, clean resonance. It also lets us go nuts with the spring reverb, since it tends to really pick up and accentuate those sharp, high-energy transients. By making the transient less aggressive, we can sort of drench this thing in reverb, and it still sounds like it's kind of far away. It doesn't overwhelm us. Now we're going to bring in a second oscillator to do some audio rate filter FM, and we're going to make this bass talk, kind of. A nice clean triangle wave works the best for this. Into a nice clean filter, patch that output into a VCA, patch the VCA's output into the filter's volt per octave input. I'll turn off pitch tracking on oscillator number 2, so it's independent and not following the pitch of oscillator 1. I'll start with the frequency very low, I'll fire up the transport, bring up the modulation index, and play with some parameters to see how it sounds. Now to me that kind of sounds like a formant, like a vowel, like a talking synth. It also kind of sounds like a bit crusher. If you've ever run a really resonant filter through a bit crusher, you might have noticed that it sounds like a human voice. Now this is entirely analog, the oscillator, the VCA, and the filter. There's no digital processing going on, but it winds up having a very similar effect, and it's really cool. The parameters that really matter for dialing this sound in are the filter cutoff, the amount of the envelope applied to the filter cutoff, the modulation index, and the modulator's frequency. Another thing that we can do that really changes the character of it is to activate pitch tracking. With a complex oscillator like this one, there's generally a switch you can flip that will have both oscillators track the same CV input, but if you're using two separate oscillators, you can pretty easily do the same thing by just multing your pitch CV to both oscillators. Let's see how it changes the sound when we have them both tracked together. Now the sustained high-frequency buzzing of this can be a bit intense, so let's just use it as more of a transient effect. We'll dial up another envelope and use it to control the modulation index. I'll set Quadrex channel 2 to fire at the same time as channel 1. Same thing as putting a mult into the trigger inputs, just saves you a cable, and route envelope 2's output to the modulator's amplifier CV. Crank up the index and play with the fall time. The neat thing about this is we can have this really deep and subby bass with a super snappy percussive attack. It'll really cut through a mix. One of the great things about using a pulse wave for this is just by adjusting the pulse width, you can have a lot of control over how the bass sits in the mix. At 50%, you get this big, nice, hollow square wave, and the thinner you make the pulse width in either direction, it almost sounds like playing an electric bass guitar at the bridge position. The harmonics become a lot stronger than the fundamental. So if you wanted to use a kick that was more subby or had more sustain to it, this would be a good choice. I'm using a really fast kick that just has a lot of punch to it because I wanted to leave room for this big hollow square wave. love the way that square sounds through the spring, set off against the really crisp and snappy drums. For our next voice, I'll use this MCO. I'm either going to use a triangle or a sine wave out of it, something nice and clean. Patch it to the input of this WMD carbon filter. Patch the carbon's output. I'm using the 2-pole low pass into a VCA. I'm using Veil's channel 4 for this. I'll take the output of that VCA and run it to our delay. Patch the delay's output into mixer input number 2. But before it gets there, let's mult it and send that to channel 2 of our effects mixer so we can get some reverb on it. Bring up the channel fader, open the VCA, open the filter. I'd like to put some movement into this voice, so I'm going to start an LFO going. You know what, let's make it a unipolar LFO. You can use a looping function for this. Channel 4, take the output of channel 4 and run it into the CV input of the amplifier. Maybe adjust the response of this, make it a little more exponential. That'll do, and I'll use our last envelope, also as a unipolar looping function, whose output will go to channel 1 of the SPO, so we can attenuate and offset it. SPO's output goes to the CV input of the ornament and crime. Get a stream of gates going here. Channel 1 on PAMs, let's make it times 4, 16th notes. Start the transport. No bass for right now. Patch the sample and holds output into the volt per octave. We'll have this 16th note gate, trigger the sample and hold, and have the sample and holds output go to the MCO's volt per octave. Nice, alien music. We've been here before. Let's turn on the quantizer, bring up the bass line, find something that fits. So we can sort of play peekaboo with the filter. Bring some of the delay's wet signal in. Now I want to automate this filter opening. Go to channel 4 PAMs. Choose something weird but not that weird. Maybe set it to divide by 3. We'll make it a sine wave, and this will be a Euclidean LFO. So make the amount of steps 4 and the amount of triggers 2. Connect it to the filter's FM input, turn up the index, and see how it goes. I'm pretty happy with that. Bring it all together and see what it sounds like. Somewhere along the line, things got out of tune. We'll be right back. Hey folks, we're back. I think we solved the tuning issue. Somewhere in there, the modular got about a half step off from what was going on with the tune percussion and the drum machine, so I just retuned the toms and we should be close. For those of you who are really bothered by tuning issues, that was probably a really vexing 10 minutes and I apologize for that, but I'm not doing it over. When I fail, you fail with me. Okay, there are a few things that I want to clean up about this patch before we call it a day. The first thing is I'd like to modulate the time of the LFO that is wiggling our little BLERPS. And to do that, I'm going to take an 8th note gate from PAMs, use it to trigger channel 2 of the ornament and crime, which is just a sample and hold, kicking out random values with every trigger. It doesn't need a CV input. I'll take the output of that channel, run it into my slew limiter, take the output of the slew limiter. We need an attenuator, so I'll just use a VCA for that, channel 2 of Veil's. Take the output of channel 2 and run it into CVB on the quadrex, which I believe I have set up to modulate the fall time of this LFO. We'll see if I'm right when I push up this fader. I like that, it's just moving around a little bit more on us now. And all that murk in the background, I have the bass muted, but this is a pre-fader sense, so we're still hearing the wet version of the bass through the reverb. I'm okay with that. The other thing that bothers me is I'm using this filter to sort of show and hide that wobbling sine wave. But the thing is, it doesn't totally make it go away between cycles of this LFO that's opening and closing the filter. So what I'd like to do is put another VCA in line that's controlled by this same control voltage so that it completely silences it between cycles. As it is, we're just getting some sort of low-mid, wobbly, murky, rumbly stuff that isn't really doing much for us, and it's muddying up the mix. So, take our Veils 4 output, patch it to another VCA, Veils 3, take Veils 3, open up the offset, we're right where we were, except I'm going to molt this Euclidean LFO control voltage and use it to open this VCA. You know, I put this slew limiter in here because I thought that I'd really want some control over the slide between voltage changes going to this LFO, but I haven't really missed it. Actually, that is kind of neat. We'll see how it shakes out over time.